Yeah.
which people went to.
And usually a politician would come out and speak. There would be, or maybe Dr. Hull would speak, or somebody like that. Up in the, there was a flagpole up in the middle of the village, and I'd gather around that.
There were band concerts.
Yes, the
Petersburgh
band.
had a band
Petersburgh
then, didn't it?
always
Yeah.
had a band. It's just since the children have studied music in school that you can't get a band together.
That's right.
Before they had that, there was a great pride in the band, and we always had a band. And it distresses me awful that all these children learn how to play all these instruments and
There's no band.
No
Well, I
band.
guess there's a school, now it's at the school, which is now no longer a Petersburg school. So it's a school band, and it's down in Berlin, and it's not so much of a town thing.
and they drop it. These bands weren't children's bands; they were grown men that. I don't remember any women playing in it,
I
but
don't
there were
either.
men that did it for years until they got so old they couldn't march, and they would decorate a truck and ride on the truck.
There was, I remember, there was the East Hollow picnic. That was a big event.
Yes, that's
band
up
would
in your
play.
territory.
Band would play, and they'd serve homemade ice cream, and
Who sponsored that?
I don't know who organized it. Was it just the East Hollow people that?
I think so.
Spearheaded
I think it was the
that,
families up there that, and there was oh dear, what was their name? Burdick. Orson Burdick's folk. We'd see them goodbye, and they had what they called the old buckskin band, and they had huge, great big drums on their wagon when they went by, and they would play, the old buckskin band would play at the East Hollow picnic. And the East Hollow picnic was always when the corn was particularly good,
Sweet corn.
August, and they always had sweet corn. They'd have wonderful food up there, and it was a great event.
So it was for the whole town, the East Hollow picnic.
Well, it was mainly Moons and Weavers and Hewitts and I presume churches. Can just remember going to one. I can remember going to one East Hollow picnic. I'd mainly stand out and watch kind of longingly as people went by. But one year I got invited to go, and I went to the East Hollow picnic.
Then the churches had their socials and their
Oh, yeah.
suppers and this sort of thing. And then there were other organizations. I remember the Masons and the Eastern Stars. They used to put on parties
And dime socials.
and dime socials. Yeah.
What are dime socials?
Well, I'll let Victoria describe.
Well, they were the fee was a dime. You paid a dime, and you'd go, and then I think you could buy other things when you got there, like you could buy a dish of ice cream, or they'd have cakes and pies and things, and play cards, and sometimes they'd have music and they could dance. That would be at the Masonic Temple, which is now the Meeting House Antiques,
Right.
or the
Town and Country Brokerage.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What about school, which is, also a big part of children's lives? Can you describe something of did you both go to school here in town?
Yes, first 8 grades.
Can you describe that building and what it was like?
Well, there was a two-room school. It was the lower grades were downstairs and the upper grades were upstairs. There was no electricity. There was no plumbing. There was an outdoor toilet and woodshed combined that was next to the school. And the water was brought from the cut. Now, you don't know what the cut is. You've lived here how many years?
21.
21 years, and you've never heard of the cut, have you?
Not
No,
unless
nobody
it's the
knows.
railroad cut. That's the only
It was
cut
the
I know of.
railroad cut,
Okay.
and it was had been cut through solid rock there, just on the south side of the railroad bridge. For quite some distance, they had cut through there, and there was a spring. There was a spring there in the cut, in the rock there at the cut. And in the morning, the big boys would take a pail, and they would go to the cut and get a pail of water. And that was the water that we had for if we needed a drink of water or anything, we'd get this water from this pail that they brought up from the cut.
And to avoid drinking out of the same dipper, our teachers taught us how to make paper cups.
Yeah, the teacher,
And
that's
they-
one of the first things we would
Take
learn
the
would be
1/2
how
by
to make
11
a
sheet of
paper cup.
and fold it to make a drinking cup.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and downstairs, in this, where the first 4 grades were, there was one large wood heater, and upstairs there was another one. And part of your job as we took turns, the bigger boys and girls putting wood in. And I remember the big blocks of wood, you could open the door and you could put in 2 or 3 of those, and they'd burn for hours.
Was it warm in the building with that?
I think it
Oh,
was,
yeah.
yeah.
If it wasn't, if it was too cold and there was cold around the edges, you could take a stick of wood and sit up around the stove. Sometimes on a very cold day, we did that, but not very often. The teacher were very, I think, as I think back, they were pretty smart
They had to
people.
be. They were.
They could keep this room, there were probably, what, 30 children, wouldn't you say?
I would say.
In each room, and 4 grades in each room, and they would manage to keep us all busy. And I'm sure, as I hear stories about the children in school now, that we were much better behaved and disciplined than they are nowadays. Certainly. No, I don't ever remember anybody bringing a gun, or you can read about it in New York City, but you don't. In Petersburg, we were, I think, very well behaved. There wasn't any discipline problem.
No, I don't recall any serious ones. I do remember that sitting in a classroom where there are 4 grades, you could eavesdrop on the grade ahead of you when they were up front having their geography lesson, and you could learn a lot just by listening.
That's right.
And actually, I think that was an advantage of the one-room school, that you had older boys and girls that you could go to for help if you had trouble, and sometimes the teacher would let you do that. Because they just didn't have it. There wasn't enough of them to go around, just one person and 30 children, and sometimes they'd have someone older help you. I remember that.
Did you each have your own books? Did you have?
Yes, we bought our own books. The
Bought
school
them.
didn't supply the books. And I can still remember a lot of poetry that we had in our school books that were read. And as Earl said, you'd hear the same things year after year until it would come to your mind. And lots of nights now when I can't sleep, I can say to myself some of that poetry that
You remember hearing?
that I
it?
remember. Yes.
Well, we had to memorize a part of the Song of Hiawatha. Remember
Yeah.
that? We had
Yeah.
to memorize Trees by Joyce Kilmer, and see what else. Excelsior. I don't know if you remember that poem. I can't think now who the author of that was.
Sir Walter Scott,
Sir
I
Walter
can
Scott.
remember. Breathes there a man with soul so dead who never himself has said, and things like that. That I don't think they even have in their books now. Certainly they didn't for a while when they were saying see spot run. But when we were little kids, we had books that had fine poetry in them that we used to.
And the readers had little morals and stories, which you don't find today. And I remember in one of the little readers that we had, maybe it was in 3rd or 4th grade, that was a boy had been to the pond, and he had thrown stones, and he had killed a frog, and the man who owned the property came along, and I remember one of the punchlines was, boys, that may be fun for you, but it's death for the frogs. You know? And so you felt sad to think that they had killed this innocent little animal. But you don't find anything like that in books these days.
It's getting dark here. I don't know if I can see my questions.
Well, turn on the light. There's a light right by you. It pushes, that's it. I was thinking it's getting pretty
Yeah.
dark. I ought to turn on the lights, but I hated to interrupt.
I
But
know. It sounds like there was more, in terms of techniques, that there was more maybe memorizing when you were in school than there is?
Yeah, I think so.
I believe that.
Yes, I
Yeah,
believe that's
I believe that's
true.
Even in high school, there was more of it. I think we were asked memorizing poetry.
Did you give, was there what they called recitation too? Did you have to stand up and give talks to the
Yes.
class? And
Yes. Oral English, we used to call it.
Yeah.
did you get homework?
Yeah.
Yes.
Particularly arithmetic. Seems to me as though I always had to bring my arithmetic. But we did things that I see recommended now as being new ideas or ideas that have come back. But we could advance at our own rate. We could, I was poor in arithmetic, so I'd be in second grade arithmetic and reading out of a fourth grade reader and things like that. We could.
They call it individualized
Yeah,
curriculum.
well, we had that, absolutely, in those days.
Mhm.
You could,
That must have been very hard for a single teacher, though, to keep track of the 30 kids and
I
where
think
each was
so.
in each subject.
And you think that each of the classes is broken down into 4 or 5 subjects that they
Yeah,
had to teach.
right.
Math and spelling and English and history and of course there wasn't physical education to cope
Mhm.
with back in those days. We just went out and played at recess. But I do remember they used to have us stand up, they'd open the windows, you remember that?
Yeah.
And you'd do deep breathing exercises.
we'd have, and we'd do a little calisthenics, a
Yeah.
little.
Were there any sports teams? Like, did they have, like, after-school baseball or basketball?
No,
Good
that
players.
was
Oh,
not.
no, we just picked up our own teams, whoever was good would.
I think that's why when I went to Hoosick Falls High School, I wasn't good in athletics, and I dreaded becoming involved because I hadn't learned those skills in elementary school. Some of the village kids up there were good ball players and had played basketball, and I hadn't had that opportunity.
Were there like groups in the school? I know sometimes now there are like the in kids and the out kids. There are cliques, they call them. Was there any of that in the school?
Well, when I came down here, there were the village kids, and some of us from outside town sort of had to work our way in, and I was shy, having grown up by myself out in the country, and I remember a few little incidents that from my childhood. I remember a couple of the boys who tended to be bullies, and I remember being bullied, and but nothing serious. It didn't last too long, and then you became accepted. But initially, I remember that was a little problem. And in a sense, I think when small town kids went to a bigger school, like high school, even in Hoosick Falls, I think that you were, for a little while, you were sort of
Strange,
you
yeah.
were strange. You were sort of on the outside, and the kids who lived right in where the high school is, they were more of a club.
I was going to ask about bullies, but
No, there were bullies. Used to get dragged over the thistles once in a while
Ooh.
by a bully.
I was going to ask what kinds of things they did. Drag you over the thistles?
I remember our playground was in back of the school, and there was a big rock back there. And, I remember this one boy who was probably 2 or 3 grades ahead of me, and he didn't like me very well, and I don't know, I must have said something that made him angry, and I was sitting near the rock, and I remember getting dragged down the hill over a thistle. But there weren't many of those incidents.
Did the teachers intervene at all, and did they do anything?
I don't remember any. I don't know if any of them ever knew it.
Do you remember getting in trouble at school for anything?
I got in trouble. I got in awful trouble, and still I resent it because I couldn't sing. I cannot carry a tune to save my soul. And Miss Violet Church, who was my teacher, had this rule: everybody had to sing. And I had been told so many times that I couldn't sing, and that I put everybody else off, and I wasn't to sing. And then here I was told to sing, and I refused. And I can remember that she took me and one of the big boys and hit our heads together. She took our heads like that, and I was terribly humiliated. But she never got me to sing.
I'm sure I must have gotten in trouble. I just can't think of any
Remember
specific
it?
instances.
What about other kids? Do you remember, what was considered being in trouble in schools and what the consequences were?
Well, one punishment was you had to put your nose in a chalk ring. You had to stand up, and they put a chalk ring, and you had to stand with your nose in the chalk ring, or you had to stand in a corner.
And you sometimes would get a ruler across the knuckles if they were really bad. I remember one boy, he just couldn't help it. He was just a born clown, and I remember him putting a long piece of a rag or something in his belt and going down the aisle and switching his tail like a lion. And the teacher caught him doing it, and I remember he got really wrapped across the knuckles with a ruler. But
Oh, and we had, when I was little, I don't know what you ever had. Did you ever had geography?
yes,
And we had big geography books, and you'd have to stand with the geography book on your arm like
Ooh.
that for a few minutes. That was kind of painful.
That's hard to do.
Yes,
But
and
I don't
then
remember.
you'd want to do this, and then you bend that elbow, and you would get told you were to keep it right up, right straight.
I don't ever remember kids being kept after school. Do you? Like much? I don't remember that.
No, I don't remember being kept after school. We used to have nature study, too, and we'd take walks, and we'd learn to identify birds, and I always liked those. Sometimes on Friday afternoon. I don't know if they ever did when you went to school.
Yeah, they did.
But Bible Church was pretty good at teaching.
Did kids like school, or did they hate school? Did they
Well,
just
some
what
did,
you did,
some-
or was it a?
I think a lot of kids enjoyed school. I think that there were dropouts as boys would get older because sometimes their fathers needed them home on the farm. And I know in my father's case, he loved school and he would have loved to have gone on, but he didn't get beyond the 6th grade because his father took him out of school and he needed him to work. And he always regretted that. He wanted to go to high school. But I don't remember in my own class where, but I do remember some leaving at the end of their 7th or 8th grades because they were needed at home.
Is there anything else that you can think of that you would want to include? That's
Well, I think I've about exhausted my memory bank. It was
Church played a big part
Yeah.
in our growing up. The entertainments at the church, going to church and to Sunday school, and the Sunday school was a very important part of our life and of our social life. Our social life centered around the church.
It was a good time to grow up. And as I look back on it, I think we were benefited in many ways from growing up in small town.
Mhm.
And, the families were close knit. You did simple things, but you learned to enjoy the simple things.
Yeah. The Christmas entertainment and the Sunday school picnic and all those social events were
You didn't have to
centered
travel,
around the church.
You didn't have to travel a great distance or spend a lot of money. You could have fun at home.
Mhm.
Do you remember feeling bored?
Yes, I believe I was bored at times, probably, but that I think maybe that was because I was alone more and I didn't have anyone to play with. But it was a very short duration because there was always work to
jobs.
be done, and I knew I had certain chores that I had to do, and you'd soon forget about it.
From
No, it was a good life. I look back on it, thankful that I had the experience.
Is there anything just, having the perspective of years that you have that you would want to say to kids who are maybe 9 or 10 today?
You mean advice to give them? No, I don't.
Not necessarily advice, just thoughts or something you wish you'd realized when you were a kid that you realize now, or.
Well, I guess I would say you're young only once, and really enjoy it where you are at the age you are, and don't think you have to hurry up and grow up and inherit all the problems that grown-ups have. Just enjoy being a child and being a young boy or girl.
My family were strict Sabbatarians. My grandmother was a Seventh-day Baptist, really. She had been brought up as a Seventh-day Baptist. And she started keeping, as she called it, keeping the Sabbath. She started on Friday night. On Friday night after supper, she put on a white apron, and she was keeping, and she kept all the way through Sunday night, because her father had been a Seventh-day Baptist and her husband was a First-day Baptist, so she kept them both. And during this time, the rest of us only had to keep Sunday. And you asked if I was bored. I used to get bored on Sundays because we weren't allowed to do much of anything. We couldn't. We could read our Sunday school papers, and that was just about what we could do on Sunday. You never could. We couldn't go play with the other children. We couldn't play cards. We couldn't play games. We kept, and that was kind of got kind of tiresome.
Was that the same for you?
Yeah, to a certain extent. Not that strict. See, being on a farm, there were certain routines.
You had routine. You had to do anyway.
You still had to water the horses and milk the cows and feed the chickens and all those things. But to a certain extent, I remember Sunday afternoon was a time that the grown-ups would like to rest and take naps, and so that leaves somebody who isn't sleepy to find something to do.
Yeah.
And I remember walking alone in the fields and the woods and trying to think of things to do.
You couldn't knit. You couldn't sew. You couldn't. You couldn't do any of the things that you like to do. Or you could read, but you had to be careful on what you read. You couldn't read everything on Sunday. Mainly the Sunday school paper and the Bible, of course. You could read the Bible and the Sunday school papers, and that was about it. And I liked to play games. And, you couldn't play dominoes. You couldn't play any games at all. And I can remember my mother being completely horrified. It was during World War I. And somebody came out from Troy. I believe it was a minister, but it may not have been. Somebody came out and preached at the Baptist church. And there was all the knitting for the soldiers, And his wife sat and knitted in church on Sunday. And I can tell you that it was a shocking experience for my mother to see that woman sit there in church and knit on Sunday. We weren't allowed to do any such thing, even for the soldiers in the trenches. We had to keep the Sabbath.
The war was supposed to stop on Sunday.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Well, you were certainly welcome. I enjoyed chatting.
I don't know whether the children